finance in the post-COVID-19. We are all concerned with the current pandemic situation and economic that it's hitting all countries without exception. Therefore, the conference, the African Economic Conference held in Sao under the theme Financing Africa in the Post-COVID-19 era, with the cooperation with important partners like AFDB and the Program for the United Nations for the Development Program of the United Nations could not come at a most opportune moment. I'm convinced that these 3 days will result certainly in high-quality debates on the current challenges that we are facing in Africa. And amongst these challenges, we highlight the pressing need for an economic growth, the reforms, the urgent reforms to be made in our countries, the reflection on the pertinence of economic models, current economic models, and highlighting the consequences of the informal sector, the weaknesses of our health systems, the lack of social protection, and the vulnerabilities that exist in the fiscal systems. We all agree that in order for us to achieve the SDGs 2030, we have to implement quickly and completely all the commitments and the consensus of monitoring and the agenda of Addis Ababa 2015. We should therefore continue to move forward with our reflections and actions based on these principles and recommendations. We registered the presence of distinguished representatives and partners like UNECA, the AFDB, the program, the development program of the United Nations, but also a broad assistance, including participants with diverse experiences linked to economy, which will bring good results. The plenary sessions and the parallel events constitute a special tribune for the ideas on how we can improve and mobilize more necessary resources internationally and domestically in order to help our countries to fight the negative effects of COVID-19 and aid us in creating new platforms for progress in fulfilling all our commitments of 2030 of the United Nations. We live effectively in a difficult context marked by the pandemic crisis. Throughout Africa, the COVID-19 has made millions of victims, and despite the vaccination programs implemented in each one of our countries, we know that the results are far from being satisfactory due to the limitation of universal access to vaccines. If a few countries were able or have been able to move forward in this combat, like is the case of Cabo Verde, which reached 86% of the adult population to be vaccinated and 66% of the eligible population to be vaccinated with the first dose. In other countries, we know that such does not happen, especially in a time where we have a new variant. Mr. President of the Republic, Mr. Vice Prime Minister, Mr. Minister, Finances of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Africa is used to manage crisis, but it never crossed a difficult moment like this one. We need to prepare ourselves to live eras that are perhaps more difficult in the near future, facing the pandemic crisis, the financial crisis, the economic crisis, the energy crisis, the monetary crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, crisis such that several times mixed with political instability that do not spare several of our regions. Meanwhile, I hope that the proposals developed throughout this conference will be translated into specific and concrete actions and that will be able to mitigate the impact of this crisis. Within this context, the island, the SIDS in development are amongst the most vulnerable, like is the case of Cabo Verde, and deserve a special attention and inclusive in support of its development, financing, and the integration in the continent, avoiding that the small island countries in development are left behind. We have the urgent obligation to protect our citizens in the face of the new COVID-19 variant and create a new basis for the new normal. The acts to finance to vaccines constitute, without a doubt, a great challenge for countries that within this context and of lack of access to finance are faced with this enormous challenge. We need to find different options of finance, such as the exchange of debt by development, the swaps with creditors that have been identified and that are strategic partners of our different countries, and finally, the renegotiation of the debt involving the private sector in these negotiations. The effects of the pandemic, we are all aware of it because it made our countries, it led our countries to increase exponentially, increasing the public expenditures, leading us to the internal and external debt, increasing the public debt. In this sense, it's necessary to renegotiate the debt in several cases. I would even say the pardon of the debt in exchange for strong commitments with our country in doing sustainable projects and social projects, capacity building of the education, health, as well as infrastructure programs as a factor of sustainable development. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, before finalizing, I would like to appeal to an active participation in all debates that follow throughout these days. We need to help the organizers and partners of this conference to reach the proposed result, to mobilize funds to finance our countries at this time of great challenge. In the same line of concern, the General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, defended last year the availability and the access to all to the vaccines. The need to revert the decrease the credit lines for countries of medium-income countries. At the time, he exhorted the governments to consider a tax of solidarity over those that made profit during the pandemic in order to decrease the extreme inequalities. We should all together continue to make efforts, to make all the necessary efforts to reach a dynamic and effective partnership for the development and answer efficiently to the challenges imposed by COVID-19. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Rui Figueiredo Soares, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cabo Verde, you have raised some critical points that give us an important framing as to the work ahead of us in the days to come. You have reiterated the critical importance of development models that work, the importance of universal access to vaccines as a first-generation question to promote the recovery. You've also reminded us about the multiple crises that Africa faces right now: energy, monetary, health, and more. You touched on the question of leaving no one behind and the unique situation of SIDS. And finally, also the important point you made around solutions that might include debt renegotiation. I think there's a lot of food for thought in the minister's opening remarks, welcome remarks, that give us a sense as to where the issue is, but also ultimately where some of the solutions could take shape. So thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for those welcome remarks. Before we get into the opening remarks from the organizing partners, that is UNDP, AFDB, and UNECA, I'd like for us to watch a video that tells us a little bit about what the conference is about. Let us watch the video.
For nearly 2 years, the world is trying to live with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're still at the worst of the medical emergency, with an immense impact on the economy. Across Africa, the pandemic is expected to push 40 million people into extreme poverty. Debt burdens are likely to rise by 10 to 15% points in the short to medium term. Business as usual is not an option.
Africa will need an additional $425 billion in external funding between now and 2025 to fully recover from the pandemic. Economic governance and creativity have to be part of the financing solution.
So increasingly, Africa is looking to capital markets as a source of financing. And this is really the new wave in terms of how the financing structure or landscape of Africa is going to look like going forward.
To succeed, African countries need to think home. Improving domestic revenue mobilization, transparency and accountability, and public finance management, and overall macroeconomic policy governance will go a long way to improve the financing for development in Africa.
It is time to find innovative solutions to sustain growth, to rethink development financing models, to strengthen regional and continental integration. Welcome to Cabo Verde. Welcome to the African Economic Conference, where the bold discussions will be held to finance Africa's post-COVID-19 development. How should Africa prepare for post-COVID-19 recovery and transition? Do African countries' financial systems fit the reality? Why have decades of spending had such a small impact on improving the lives of the poor? What would be the next normal for digital transformation after COVID-19? jointly organized by the United Nations Development Program, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank Group. The conference calls for a radically new approach, a platform to take new ideas on board, to bring positive transformation, to find new solutions and meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, to rethink our economies and redesign our future. Because now more than ever, it is possible to think about change, to foster innovation, to build Africa one idea at a time.
Building Africa one idea at a time. At this conference, I think there will be several development ideas. And so at this point in time, it is my pleasure to invite us to watch a message from Mr. Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, to welcome us to the conference. Let us see the video from Mr. Achim.
Excelentíssimo Presidente,
the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, my dear colleague Dr. Vera Songwe, Acting Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank, Professor Kevin Orama, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege to join the 2021 edition of the African Economic Conference. It is jointly organized by the African Development Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Program. And it takes place at a moment of profound upheaval. The COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, demographic transitions, and the fourth industrial revolution are just some of the issues radically reshaping Africa's development landscape and pathways. In this fluid context, countries across the continent need to make smart, bold choices on how to build forward better from this pandemic. And to do so, I would like to share with you 4 issues that I believe will be part of this pathway forward. Firstly, we know that vaccines delayed is development denied for Africa. Therefore, we must ensure vaccine equity, which is the fastest way to end this pandemic. Rallying around the unifying strength of the United Nations, we need the urgent cooperation of vaccine manufacturers, vaccine-producing countries, and countries that already have high vaccination rates to tackle this acute vaccine supply shortage. Doing so will help to open up economic and social opportunities across the continent, boosting GDP and driving forward human development and recovery. Secondly, we are seeing worrying signs of an uneven global economic recovery manifesting itself. It is estimated that Africa will require $425 billion in additional external financing over the next 4 years to get the global goals back on track. Indeed, countries like South Sudan spend 11 times more on debt service than on essential social services. Therefore, countries across the continent need new access to finance and debt relief measures, as well as innovative financing solutions. Let's look, for instance, to UNDP's SDG Impact Initiative, which is presenting the business case for investors to align their activities and investments with the Sustainable Development Goals. Worldwide, it is now helping countries to unlock billions of dollars, and its potential for a similar impact in Africa is immense, including on domestic financial markets. UNDP is also supporting countries to make new strategic investments in the burgeoning African continental free trade area, everywhere from Uganda to Mauritania to Senegal. We're also working with our partners to regenerate the Sahel region through a brand new approach that will foster stability and support young entrepreneurs, our Sahel offer. Thirdly, countries on the African continent need more support to transition to a greener economy centered on decisive climate action, but also greening traditional sectors such as energy and transport, and leveraging agriculture and food systems. That involves spurring a just energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, presenting great new potentials and economic opportunities. With our partners, UNDP pledges to support access to clean and affordable energy to 500 million additional people across the world, including 150 million people in the Sahel region over the next 4 years. We're also assisting countries in Africa to enhance their nationally determined contributions, their national climate strategies through the UNDP Climate Promise. As a result, we are seeing many countries, such as Cabo Verde, enhance their NDCs, showing immense leadership as they do so and contributing to a global climate response. The next chapter of the UNDP Climate Promise, from pledge to action, was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. It commits to supporting countries also in Africa to turn their targets into bold and ambitious climate action. And finally, Africa needs to further leverage digital technology to address acute development challenges and create new jobs, the jobs of tomorrow's economy. Indeed, we have witnessed how some countries in Africa have surpassed many developed countries already in the technology sphere. For instance, when it comes to digital finance and inclusive digital finance. Guided by our digital strategy, UNDP is now helping communities to test and frame these new solutions. Consider, for instance, the work of the UNDP Accelerator Labs network, which supported nearly 2,000 grassroots solutions in the year 2020 alone. That included everything from using 3D printing to create protective equipment for health workers to rolling out robots in COVID-19 treatment centers in Rwanda and Kenya. Crucially, the United Nations is also supporting and helping to equip people with the digital skills they now need while supporting efforts to roll out affordable broadband. President Neves, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, guided by our new strategic plan, UNDP will continue to work with key partners like the African Union to offer cutting-edge development support to countries across the continent of Africa. Indeed, the entire United Nations family is proud to work with communities to co-create groundbreaking solutions that will help to drive down poverty, create new opportunities, and spur decisive climate action. In many ways, this African Economic Conference provides us with a unique and timely opportunity to contribute to a much-needed reset across the African continent. I look forward to the rich conversations over the next 3 days that my colleagues will accompany and support. They will help to provide a much clearer picture of that greener, more sustainable and more equitable future that is so integral to Africa's aspiration about the coming years, and to our commitment as UNDP to work and walk by your side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Achim Steiner, for those reflections and opening remarks. Indeed, we are faced with profound upheaval. You've given us 4 indications as to where some of the solutions could lie. Vaccine equity, paying attention to ensure we have an equal recovery, a recovery that is equal, the need to pay attention to green dimension of the recovery, but even more, those places where Africa is actually leading, like digitalization. So indeed, the reset has been heard, and we shall use it to guide the conversations over the next few days. It is now my pleasure to invite Professor Kevin Urama, Acting Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank. The African Development Bank is a core partner in the organization of this conference. So let's listen to the message from the African Development Bank, please.
Songwe, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa.
Senhor Hakim Schneider, administrador. do Programa de Desenvolvimento das Nações Unidas, pessoal do corpo diplomático, representantes da África e do resto do mundo, caros participantes, senhoras e senhores, tenho a honra de dar as boas-vindas à Conferência Econômica Africana, organizados pelo BAD e pelo PNUD. Gostaria de expressar a minha gratidão ao pessoal de Cabo Verde.
Beautiful and dynamic country. I bring you warm greetings from Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank Group, who is unable to join us for this year's conference. President Adesina has asked me to convey his best wishes for fruitful discussions in identifying sustainable ways to enable Africa to finance its recovery from COVID-19 pandemic and emerge more resilient than ever. The theme for this year's conference, Financing Africa's Post-COVID Development, is very timely. The pandemic has had and continues to have significant socioeconomic impacts in Africa. As well, it puts tremendous pressures on Africa's development financing challenges. Since the start of the pandemic on the continent in February 2020, Africa has seen more than 8 million confirmed COVID-19 cases, resulting in over 200,000 deaths and counting. The pandemic could push up to 40 million people into extreme poverty if no urgent action is taken. The rollout of vaccination programs in Africa has been slow, and the emergence of new COVID variants with multiple mutations has thrust many countries into another wave of the deadly virus. Beyond the human tragedy, the economic impacts of COVID-19 has included permanently closed businesses, long-term employment losses, and delays to academic calendars, all of which have long-term negative impacts on people's lives. Africa's real GDP growth is expected to average 3.4% in 2021, after contracting by about 1.8% in 2020, making this the continent's first recession in over half a century. Between 2021 and 2023, real GDP growth is expected to remain below 4%. The pandemic has heightened the need for transformative domestic reforms to achieve key development objectives, including stronger health systems, social protection, and debt sustainability. By putting significant pressures on already strained government finances in many countries, the pandemic is forcing African countries to rethink the prevailing development finance model. Many would argue that the entire financing ecosystem of African economies should be rethought, including from a legal perspective to facilitate the financing of the private sector, the strengthening of property rights, and access to guarantees for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. The challenges of financing Africa's development must be tackled collectively. This conference, therefore, provides a platform to explore ways and means to expand Africa's development finance sources. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, while the full impacts of the pandemic and when it might end is difficult to predict, there is hope that Africa will emerge more resilient. Commodity prices are on the rise, stringent pandemic measures are being relaxed, global trade is recovering, and capital inflows have picked up again. There is hope for greater vaccination rates on the continent as more vaccines become available. Hope that prudent monetary and fiscal policies will be given priority by African governments. Hope in the lessons learned from the past year and a half on harnessing digital technology to shape the work environment and ensure business continuity. And hope that the fostered dialogue and exchanges of knowledge regarding the financing of Africa's development post-COVID-19 during this conference will deepen analysis of current challenges and lead to fruitful implementation of recommendations across Africa. Prior to the pandemic, the bank had estimated that Africa's infrastructure investment needs alone could range from $130 billion to $170 billion per year, creating an annual financing gap of $68 to $108 billion. The health infrastructure gap alone was estimated to be about $26 billion annually. With the pandemic that has laid bare the urgent need to build quality health care infrastructure and pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity, these investment needs have increased further. The bank group estimates that African governments would need about $484 billion within the next 3 years to address the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic and support recovery. Despite significant strides made by many African governments to improve the continent's financial systems and increase the levels of financial inclusion, much more needs to be done to reduce the existing savings and investment gap. The new wave of the pandemic, along with the extended government relief actions that accompany it, are also expected to put further pressure on the debt situations of many countries. This is particularly worrying in African economies where the debt-to-GDP ratio is estimated to increase by 10 to 15 percentage points by the end of 2021, relative to the previously stable debt-to-GDP ratio of around 60%. The pandemic has also caused a decline in access to international capital markets, with the widening of spreads on African sovereign bond yields due to investors' greater perception of risks and capital flight from Africa, estimated at over $90 billion in 2020. Remittance inflows, which is the most important source of financial inflows to Africa, have declined by about 6% between 2020 and 2019. And the same declining trend has been observed for foreign direct investments, official development assistance, and portfolio investments. Government revenues are estimated to have declined on average by 10 to 15% in 2020 across sub-Saharan Africa, with average revenue to GDP decreasing by 2 percentage points to 18% in 2020 from about 20% in 2019. Some estimates in 2020 indicated that COVID restrictions would contract African exports by 17%, resulting in a 5% drop in public revenue losses. For this reason, it is vital that African countries increase their tax base by addressing structural bottlenecks such as weak organizational structures, low capacity of tax officials, and a lack of modern, computerized risk management techniques. Without a doubt, therefore, financing from conventional sources has become more challenging than ever. Nevertheless, it is important to point out that the resources are there. Mobilization of available resources will require a serious attempt to address deficiencies in the banking and financial systems as well as in the public sector. That's why we must support the appropriate formulation of policies that deliver tangible impacts in this regard. I am confident that deliberations in this conference will contribute to such a policy agenda. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in the same manner that the pandemic has inspired innovative approaches in sectors such as health, education, e-commerce, transformative development financing models should also be encouraged. Digitization can create new dynamics in governance and help improve management of existing resources, curb illicit financial flows, and potentially free up capital for more productive uses. It could also facilitate coordination amongst various government entities focused on resource mobilization, such as tax agencies, investment promotion units, central banks, and the Treasury. African countries must urgently leverage the digital technology to improve efficiency in tax collection and revenues. Going digital will help to streamline the often cumbersome processes in accessing African stock markets and reduce information asymmetries between investors and investees, especially in the private equity venture capital space. Indeed, the development of stock markets, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and insurance sector will be critical for financing Africa's development post-COVID-19. With this in mind, we as policymakers, researchers, development partners, and champions of policy change are challenged to put forward financing mechanisms that have leaves no country or communities behind. For its part, the African Development Bank has deployed a mix of financing instruments to support regional member countries to combat COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts, including building a strong and resilient economic systems for Africa. In 2020, the bank disbursed $7.3 billion, a 40% increase from the $5.2 billion disbursed in 2019. The volumes were boosted by a rapid increase in disbursements from the COVID-19 Crisis Response Facility, a $3.2 billion, which was 39% of the total bank's disbursements, as the bank group supported regional member countries in fighting COVID-19 pandemic. Over 80% of the approved operations were in the form of crisis response budget support operations prepared in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Last month, the African Development Bank Group, the African Union, UNECA, pledged to work more closely together with governments by providing financial and technical assistance to beef up land governance systems. Land governance, ladies and gentlemen, is seen by many to be an influential enabler in the transformation of African food systems. Not only would this help address concerns about hunger on the continent, but it could also contribute to the generation of higher revenues by reducing a major cost of economic activity for marginalized populations. This is especially true for smallholder farmers who make up to 60% of the African population in sub-Saharan Africa, with about 23% of GDP coming from agriculture. Together with regional institutions, the African Development Bank Group is committed to building a resilient and forward-looking financial system for Africa. The pandemic provides the opportunity for creatively brainstorming on ways to boost and improve the region's ability to access financial resources needed to build resilient economies. This knowledge must be converted into policy actions and results in operational guidance in a timely manner. I conclude by acknowledging and thanking the talented minds who have joined us at this conference. The conference offers a unique opportunity to come up with practical financing solutions to recover the economy and the economic and social gains that have been built for decades. I thank you and wish you fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Urama from the African Development Bank. I think it's important, the points you've made, reminding us about the long-term negative impacts and the need to really use this conference as an opportunity to open the box and try to create new solutions that work specifically for Africa. It's interesting the points that one takes away from his intervention, because it's very much about hope and the possibilities on the continent. If we can tackle illicit financial flows, if we can tackle capital flight, if we can find ways to make Africa's money work for Africa's development. So thank you very much, Professor Urama. We will now move on to Dr. Antonio Pedro, Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNECA, and listen to the message from ECA. Thank you.
Excelentíssimo Dr. José Maria Neves, Presidente da República de Cabo Verde, Senhor
Vice Prime Minister of the Republic of Cabo Verde, Minister of Finances of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mr. Julio Lopes, Chair of the City Hall, Mayor of the City Hall of Salt, Excellencies, Mr. Eichlem Steiner, Administrator of the Program of the United Nations for Development, Professor Kevin Orama,
Acting Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Group, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Dr. Verde Songe, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission of the UNDP for Africa, I'd like to welcome you to the 16th edition of the African Economic Conference, which is being held in hybrid form in Sao. A year ago, we were in the grips of a pandemic that took countless lives, destroyed livelihoods, and derailed progress towards the SDGs.
Não obstante, continuamos.
Nonetheless, we continued the African Economic Conference tradition by organizing the first exclusively virtual conference on the theme Africa Beyond COVID-19, Acceleration Towards Inclusive Sustainable Development. As we begin deliberation on this year's theme, Finance Africa's post-COVID-19 development, it is worth noting that our recovery has been marked by divergent fiscal responses, divergent access to vaccines, and consequently, divergent recovery pathways. For instance, in March 2021, African countries spent less than 1% of their GDP in the form of equity, government loans, and guarantees in support of recovery from the pandemic. In contrast, the equivalent amount for advanced economies was 11.3%, while the global average was 6.1%. Indeed, the emergence of the Omicron variant is a consequence of an uncoordinated global response to the pandemic. At the heart of reversing the asymmetric responses to the crisis by advanced and developing countries is equitable access to affordable finance. This underlines the importance of the theme of the AEC this year.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen.
Caros, Senhor Presidente, as
$2 for developing countries were substantial even before the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has exacerbated the financing challenges. According to the 2021 OECD Global Outlook, the annual SDG financing gap in developing countries is estimated to have increased by $1.7 trillion, or roughly 70% since 2020. Meanwhile, foreign direct investments fell from 4.46% of GDP in 2015 to 3.54% of GDP in 2019, with a potential decline in 2021 due to the pandemic. The private sector was expected to contribute more than a third of the required financing for the SDGs, but the actual contributions have been significantly lower, at only 4 to 8%. We must do more to leverage private financing, especially as the fiscal buffers of developing countries come under extreme pressure. Increased expenditures coupled with declining revenues have worsened Africa's fiscal deficit, which deteriorated from minus 4.2% of GDP in 2019 to minus 7% of GDP in 2020. Following a contraction of 3.2% in 2020, real GDP is projected to rebound to 3.6% in 2021 and 3.8% in 2022, according to our own estimates. However, these rates of growth are only slightly higher than Africa's annual population of 2.2%, annual population growth of 2.3%. and we cannot assume that the positive growth rate will be sustained. Of particular concern is that many developing countries are unable to meet the essential health and humanitarian needs of their people and to recover from the socioeconomic crisis owing to growing fiscal constraints and rising debt servicing obligations. As of June 2021, over 22 of 54 African countries were either in or at high risk of debt distress, and many developing countries faced currency depreciation. In addition, inflationary pressures are on the rise, threatening to erode the purchasing power of households already reeling from the pandemic. Policymakers are now faced with the daunting task of ensuring sustained socioeconomic recovery while mobilizing resources to finance rising fiscal deficits and debt obligations. At the same time, countries are tasked to meeting their commitments to Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063, as well as tackle the emerging climate emergency. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic did not create Africa's economic, health, and climate-related vulnerability. It only exacerbated them. Nevertheless, the pandemic has brought into sharp relief the urgent need to address the continent's underlying vulnerabilities and to use the crisis as an opportunity to build back better. It has also exposed gaps in the global financial architecture and reinforced the importance of a multilateral approach to combating global shocks such as COVID-19. The possibility of new and more virulent variants, coupled with imminent climate shocks, call for a more coordinated global response to the pandemic, underpinned by bold and innovative financing mechanisms that not only scale up public financing, but also leverage private investments. Even though advanced economies have been significantly affected by the pandemic, their fiscal response to the crisis has been more robust due to their unlimited access to foreign reserves. This reality underlines the asymmetric policy responses of advanced and developing countries to the crisis. The global financial architecture has not been effective in addressing the underlying asymmetries in policy responses. Development finance mechanisms such as the IMF special drawing rights allocations, for instance, are linked to the size of an economy and not to the relative size of impact of the shock on an economy. As a result, only 5% of the unprecedented allocation of $650 billion in special drawing rights went to Africa, to the Africa region. This occurred even though the continent has the weakest fiscal space to recover from the crisis, the highest poverty rates, and comprise 70% of all least developed countries. Meanwhile, global response initiatives largely target low-income countries. But given the pervasive impact of the pandemic on all countries, regardless of the income status, such initiatives have left behind vulnerable middle-income countries, which currently account for 70% of the world's poor. Scaled-up financing from external and domestic resources is therefore essential to addressing the rising risk of African debt defaults amid COVID-19 pandemic. On the external front, Africa needs a new deal to recover from the ravages of the pandemic. For example, the Roosevelt's New Deal cost $41.7 billion at the time it was instituted. This translates to $653 billion in current US dollars, roughly equal to the total new issuance of the special drawing rights of $650 billion. Given Africa's current population of 1.37 billion people, a new deal would have to deliver $7.1 trillion in financing to equate the US New Deal on a per capita basis. The resources required to financing a New Deal are enormous and cannot be funded exclusively through public resources. Private funding will be critical. Yet, we are all aware of the cost of private financing is high in Africa. At the same time, private direct capital investments are motivated more by economic rates of return than by social welfare considerations. Blending public financing with private resources can redirect more private investments and financing to social and other orphaned sectors through risk sharing and risk mitigation. ECA and TIMCO launched the Liquid and Sustainability Facility, LSF, at the margins of COP26 with the objective of lowering the cost of portfolio investments in emerging markets and crowding. The Liquidity Sustainable Facility seeks to use inland special drawing rights to leverage private financing by making it possible for holders of African sovereign bonds to access short-term financing using such instruments as collateral. This enhances the attractiveness of such instruments, increases their demand, and lowers their yields. Furthermore, the LSF can incentivize green investments in Africa by providing preferred interest rates for green bonds issued by African sovereign. In addition to financial support, policy support and commitments to promote value addition in Africa facilitate technology transfer and limit initial financial flows from Africa should be critical elements of a new deal for Africa. I'm very pleased that the Minister of Finance of DRC is amongst the participants of the conference. We're just coming from a DRC Africa Business Forum, an innovative platform to crowding in financing for the deepening of DRC and Africa's participation in the battery and electric value chain, as well as the deployment of more renewable energy solutions in Africa. So more of this is required on the continent. Ultimately, the success of the continent's recovery from the pandemic hinges on the effectiveness of the health response. To this end, improving access to vaccines and waiving patent rights to spur local vaccines production are vital. Failure to address the pandemic through universal access to vaccines will spawn more resilient and potent variants threatening the global effort to fight the virus. The recent emergence of the Omicron variant of the COVID-19 virus illustrates my point. It is therefore in the enlightened self-interest of developed countries to facilitate increased vaccine access to the continent and to support local vaccines manufacturing. Complemented by appropriate regional and national policy measures, such initiatives will not only boost the continent's low vaccination rates, but promote job creation and scientific research in vaccines development. Without scaled-up financing for productive investments in Africa and developing countries, the divergent recovery paths reinforced by the pandemic will continue to widen, exacerbating inequalities and undermining already weakened progress.
You've been watching a live Channels television event.